Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. Hi. Hi
Hi.
Chan. Are you with us, Chan? Good. Chan's with us. She says so in the chat. Okay, good. So this week we are continuing on with our grammar exploits. Next week we'll be looking at plain English drafting, and then I promise that we'll start to get onto some more substantive contexts for drafting. So I just wanted to check in with you guys and see how it's going so far, how you're finding the materials, thoughts, issues, those kind of things. Tammy, how are you going?
Um, I'm a little time poor just recently, so I'm trying to make sure that I'm on task, which I'm pretty okay. I've got a little bit of stuff that I want to catch up on because I like to do flowcharts and sort of notes and what have you, just to make sure that it's cementing. I'm cementing the content.
Mm.
So yeah, okay. I'm still trying to get my head around all these different types of things. You think you know how to write something, and you think you know about grammar, and you think you know about all of this stuff, and then you just go, oh, okay, maybe I don't.
Well, it's still a learning journey for me, even sometimes, people like my editor might pick up on something and I go, oh, I really just didn't know that. So it is, there's always someone that can do it better than you, kind of think. The trick is just to try and identify the common errors that you're making and be conscious when you're drafting of them. That's the trick, because then at least you're not repeating those simple errors throughout your work. What about you, Cham? How are things going for you?
Yeah, things are going good. Like I'm learning a lot along the way.
Yeah.
Um, my grammar wasn't too great before I started this course, so I'm really learning with the textbook readings and the workshops that we're doing every week as well. And I'm finding the unit more interesting now because of the legal cases
Yep.
that we've had to work on as part of week three's workshop. So yeah, they were pretty interesting. So
Yeah, good.
yeah, things are
Okay.
getting interesting. So it's
Yeah, watch this space, I guess. And
yeah.
Selby, how are you going?
I'm going good, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the feedback. I really love those. I like to learn more, like being active in it. Like if you can give me feedback, the more feedback you give me, the better it is. Because you know, doing legal drafting, I think it's one of the most important things in in this area in law. And yeah, I really appreciate all the feedback that you're giving me. Yeah, and if I don't mind if other people give me feedback as well, like if other members of the group or other students do as well, because we can just then sort of toss up ideas and things like that. I like that sort of participation, and seeing what other people have to say about questions and answering things and things like that. So yeah, that's where I'm actually quite interested and very excited about this course. And
Great. That's
yeah.
good. That's good. And for those of you that don't know, Selvi has been putting her drafting from last week's task. She did the original draft and then she amended it in light of what we went through in the workshop, and she put them both on the forum in Moodle. And I've provided her with some feedback on the final version about a couple of things that can just be tweaked to even make it a little bit clearer, or pick up on some things that were missed. So if you want to have a look at someone else's drafting and sort of see what kind of things we can pick out of that, that's a good place to start. But yeah, it would be great if you guys would start posting your drafts and sharing, because at the end of the day, when you go into a job, some of you won't be legal practitioners. If you are in practice, then having people look at your work is really normal. You put file notes on the file, and so everybody can read what you've written. You have to put letters on the file that you've sent to the client so that people know where the progress is on the file. So everybody can read everyone else's work. On top of that, when you've got a supervisor, which you will do for a number of years post being newly qualified, they will quite often send you back with things to correct in your work. So you kind of have to get used to being critiqued. And of course, actually, this is a safe environment for you to do that, to get used to being critiqued, but also to prep you for that process and to help you, overcome some of those little drafting mistakes that we make at this stage, so you're not doing it in your first year or so of legal practice. So it's a safe environment. Nobody's judging you. We're all in the same position, really, that there'll all be aspects of our drafting that we do well and then bits that need tweaking. Even if you don't go into legal practice, unless you're already working in an area that you're experienced in, then quite often there's an element of supervision for things that you do. So any written component of what you're doing is likely to be observed by your supervisor in some form. So we've just got to get used to that idea of feeling exposed, because that's what it feels like, and we feel like we're being judged. But actually it's a good thing, because it helps speed up the learning process if you get that critique early on, like you are doing in this unit. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll push on. Oh, I've just noticed that we've got, is it Charalambia or Charalambia?
It's Charalambia.
Okay, so hi, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
So how are you progressing so far? The reason why I'm asking is because we're getting close to census date, so I'm just checking in with everyone and seeing how you're going.
I'm up to date with all the reading and everything. It is an interesting subject, and I chose this subject because I do have a little bit of dyslexia, so especially my grammar is not the best, and it is really important in law. So this is a very useful unit, so I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, good. All right. Well, as I say, I need to remind you that it is census day on the 4th of August, which is next week. So I do have a little think about how you're going, not just in this unit, but across all your units. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should go straight for, I'm going to withdraw. If you're finding things a bit tough, look at your schedule over the next 6 to 8 weeks. Think about whether you're going to have lulls or intense periods. Also think about the support services that are available to you as well, and use that to make an informed decision about how you want to proceed. But I hope you all stay. Okay, so I thought we'd kick off first of all with just a little unseen poll that you can, which is based on the reading. So I'll launch this now. There we go. So I'll read it out because it doesn't appear on the recording. So, which Latin maxim is likely to apply to the following sentence? The place of the company's incorporation, head office, or other similar location. So that's the phrase. Is it exclusio unius est exclusio alterius, iusdem generis, or nosciter associs? So select which of the following applies. What Latin maxim would you use there?
Which one is what?
Okay, so still waiting for 3 of you to respond, having to think about it, I think.
I can't remember how to pronounce those names.
Oh, it doesn't
but
matter.
I've got like an idea of which one it is. So.
Yeah, well, Latin's pretty tricky to pronounce anyway, so don't worry about that.
Okay, cool.
Okay, waiting for 2 more. This is anonymous, so don't worry. Okay, going to close the poll now. Okay, so we've got 1 of you, 25% thinks it's nosciter, and 3 out of 4 of you think it is iusdem generis. And I can tell you that the correct answer is iusdem generis. So because it had got or other similar location, which is a generic phrase following a list. So where you've got a list of 2 or more items, the general phrase takes its meaning from the commonality that you can establish amongst the list of specifics. Okay, so you need 2 or more, and you've got, so 2 or more specifics, whatever commonality they share, whatever characteristic they share in common is then applied to the general phrase at the end, which is, in that case, or other similar business, place of business. So the generis component is the way that you memorize that, generis, general phrase. Okay, like Chan says, like car, truck, or other vehicle. Yeah, absolutely. So the other is quite often still has a mention of something like other similar creature, but what does creature mean? It could be really, really wide. It could be anything in the animal kingdom. It takes its meaning from the specifics in the list that precede it. Okay, very good. All right, so what I wanted to do now was have a quick look at Oxford commas based on the reading that you were set for this week. So I'll just share my PowerPoints with you.
Before you move.
Yep, sure.
Sorry, just a quick question. The difference between the two, when you say cut, stab, or wound, will wound then mean that everything else, like other?
No, so let me just stop sharing that so I can talk at you for a sec. Good question, Sylvie, but no. So that's the case of Crown against Anne Harris. So it was cut, stab, or wound were the three words that were provided in a list. But wound isn't a general phrase. If it said, or other similar injury, do you see, you know, saying other similar then makes it generic. But wound is a specific word still. It's just that they didn't know how to define the word wound. And so in that instance, that specific word took its meaning from the words around it, so the words with which it was associated. And so in that case, a wound had to be had to be inflicted by an implement, because you can only cut someone or stab someone with an implement. Does that make sense?
So when you say wound, that means you can only take, when they say stab, cut, or wound, it means that if wound is not clearly defined, I can only go back to stab and cut. I cannot say anything else.
If that Latin maxim applies. Now, these are not absolute rules, and in statutory interpretation, they're never absolute because the purpose prevails. Yeah, so the purpose, you know, you always give way to the purpose of reading. But having said that, we don't have purpose readings when it comes to contracts. So there's a stronger inclination to go with the grammatical context. Does that make sense? So these Latin maxims are more important when we're considering the drafting process because they may be read into the document. So in that instance, wound would take its meaning from the two other items in the list because they're clearly a list grouped together. Does that make sense? They're alternatives. It's stab, cut, or wound.
And would not take any other meaning. Wound would not take any other meaning other than stab or cut.
Not if nosciter applies, absolutely. Yeah.
Whereas when you use the word other, it would mean other than a car, bus, or truck, other motor vehicle. Than a car, bus, or truck.
So taking Chan's example in the chat, so car, truck, or other vehicle, the word other means it's not a car and it means it's not a truck, but it doesn't mean that it's diverse from that list, okay? It doesn't mean that it's something completely different, something random like an airplane, because the generic still you have to apply the characteristic that the two other items share. So car and truck, that's quite tricky because a truck is normally carrying goods and cars normally carry people, so that can't be the characteristic. But they are all road registered vehicles, mechanically propelled vehicles, so maybe that's the classification. Does that make sense?
What about you know, those for disabled? Anything with the motor? Does that mean that anything with the motor, like a disabled?
It could be. It depends on what the court pinpoints the characteristic. And of course, that depends on the specifics. So when you've got car and truck, there's lots of things they share in common and lots of things that are different about those. So the court, you know, you might think the court's going to go for, oh, well, it's mechanically propelled vehicles. And someone else might say, oh, it's something that carries passengers and goods because cars can carry both. And a truck can carry both. So do you see what I mean? It depends on the court's interpretation, and that's dangerous because, of course, the court might plump for something that you hadn't anticipated, or it might go for something that really wasn't intended.
Yeah, so it leaves it so open to the judge's discretion as to throw whatever he or she feels like. Which makes it very tricky to go to court over something like that. you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. I mean, there's a process of reasoning behind that as well, though. You're looking at the most logical thing that it's and how it fits within the rest of the document as well. So don't forget that when we read documents, we don't just read words in isolation, we consider their entire context. And of course, if that phrase is used elsewhere, that might give some insight into what it's meant in the controversial provision. But yeah, it's a dangerous art. But having said that, sometimes it's better to have a generic like that when you know that you're looking at a situation where things are going to change and you don't want to have to keep redrafting the list. So take, for example, emerging technologies. If you're not careful, every time a new technology comes out, you're going to have to draft a new list and amend the legislation or the document. So sometimes it's better to have generics because then it makes it more flexible in terms of its application.
But generic is dangerous to put in a contract.
Can be, yeah.
Because then it can be twisted in whichever way. It leaves it open.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless it's been determined, like that particular phrase. Don't forget we've got precedents. So occasionally some phrases have been determined by courts to have a particular meaning, and that's why they're used in precedents, because they've got this fixed definition. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially when you read it in legislation, when it does that.
Yeah, I mean, again, they do that for flexibility, so that if there are things that they haven't foreseen that it might apply to, the court is able to apply it to that situation. Because drafting is not a precise science; it's not a formula, and you have to therefore have some degree of flexibility in it, because we don't all have those crystal balls. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the PowerPoints now. Okay, so looking at Oxford commas. So in this situation, an Oxford comma appears in a list. So where you've got a list of, say, 3 items, the Oxford comma goes before the very last item in the list and before the word and. So you can see there, number 2 is an example of an Oxford comma. So here, this comma here is appearing before and before the final item in the list. Okay, so here's why an Oxford comma can be, why it is important to use them sometimes. And note that they're also called serial commas in some textbooks if you come across it. Not everybody likes referring to them as Oxford commas because it's a reference to Oxford University Press, but they are in essence appearing before the last item in the list where you've got a list of 3 or more. So that's an Oxford comma here, and then it's not here in example 1. So can anyone explain the difference between these 2 sentences and why it's important to have the Oxford comma in number 2?
It can be construed that Alice and Bart are one person.
Kind of, almost. So if we look here at the first one, it says, I invited my cousins, okay? And then there's only 1 comma, which immediately follows the word cousin. Now, cousins is plural, and immediately following that is Alice and Bart. So what this implies is that Alice and Bart are the cousins who were invited. Does that make sense? So in doing it this way, it's referring back to this plural word here. So this comma creates a reference back to the previous part of the sentence. So Alice and Bart are the cousins who were invited. So when we say, I invited my cousins Alice and Bart, what we're saying is, I invited Alice and Bart, and they are my cousins. Okay? Whereas in number 2, here we can see that I invited my cousins, I also invited Alice, and I also invited Bart. So there were 3 different groups of people that were invited, Alice, Bart, and the cousins. So that's why in this instance, the Oxford comma is important, because it makes you realize that this is a list. Whereas in this one, it implies that the words following the comma refer back to the previous part of the sentence. Anyone have any questions or comments about that? So that's where Tammy, you found a sentence that was quite funny about Nelson Mandela. I'm just going to copy it now into the chat because I googled it and found it. I've seen it before, but I'm sure you guys will think this is quite funny. So it's a description about a tour that a guy called Peter undertakes. So he retraces a journey made by Mark Twain a century ago. The highlights of his global tour include encounters with Nelson Mandela, an 800-year-old demigod and a dildo collector. So the problem here is that there's only one collar following Nelson Mandela, which means that just like we just had with the cousins, that last part of the sentence refers back to the previous part of the previous bit in the sentence. So what we're saying is Nelson Mandela is the 800-year-old demigod who also collects dildos. Okay, do you get that? Yeah. Now the problem is here, they're actually trying to create a list. So he meets Nelson Mandela. He also meets, so Peter also meets an 800-year-old demigod and also meets a dildo collector. Okay, so that's what they're trying to create. But even if we put that comma after the demigod, we then create a situation where we could say that Nelson Mandela is the 800-year-old demigod, and then he also meets a separate person who collects dildos. Does that make sense? So, because what you're doing is you're creating brackets. When you've got two commas like that, so around an 800-year-old demigod, you actually create brackets. And so then you create that reference back to the earlier part of the sentence. So really, in this situation, you want to avoid the list altogether. And that really needs to be redrafted completely so that it's, you separate the sentence up so that
Nicola?
Yeah.
So is this a case where we would add the Oxford comma?
No, the Oxford comma doesn't fix it. Because
it doesn't fix it? Oh,
no,
okay.
because the Oxford comma, that's what I was saying. If it comes after demigod,
yeah,
you then create a bracket around an 800-year-old demigod. It's actually the same then as the Canadian comma case, right? You create another clause, right?
Yeah.
So in that instance, then you're saying Nelson Mandela is an 800-year-old demigod, plus Peter then goes on to meet a dildo collector. Okay, so it doesn't fix it. You've got to rewrite the sentence completely.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's just a sort of an extreme example, but you've got to be alert to it because you need to be thinking about what you're creating when you're trying to list things, or what you're missing when you're trying to list things as well. Okay, so I've just lost you guys because I pressed the wrong button. Just one second. Get you back up. Okay, so now I'll share the screen again. So thanks for that, Tammy. That was a very amusing one. So now I wanted to look at the Oakhurst Dairy case, which is the New York Times article that I asked you guys to have a look at. A short article, but really interesting. And this is the legislation. So in essence, the legislation provided that overtime would not be available. It would not be paid to workers who are involved in the following. So the canning, processing, preserving, freezing, drying, marketing, storing, packing for shipment or distribution of agricultural produce, meat and fish products, and perishable foods. So you can see we've got a list there in 1, 2, and 3, which is great. But there is also a long list in the header that leads into that list. And that's where the problem arises. So who can tell me what the problem with this particular sort of phrase or provision, what's the problem here?
I struggled with this one.
Okay, fair enough.
Distribution is not included in the list. It only refers to packing. When you read it, it's packing for shipment or distribution of.
Okay.
So where is distribution really referred to as part of the list itself?
Yep. Okay. So you're kind of on the right track there. Let me show you with the next slide how we determine it. So here you can see I've put the phrase back up there. So we've got a comma here after, so a comma after storing, but then there's no Oxford comma here. Okay. So before the word or, there's no Oxford comma to create that last component of the list. So what we have here is two options for reading this. The first is that the section applies to packing for shipment, or because this is all part of the same phrase, see how it's all part of the same phrase, so it's packing for shipment or packing for distribution. Okay, so that's because you're not breaking it up with a comma just here. The other alternative is that in this instance it applies to packing for shipment, so that's one phrase, or distribution more generally, not packing for distribution. Okay, so let's say the distribution is the transporting of the goods. In this one, in this option, distribution, the transporting of the goods would be included, and packing for shipment would be included. But in the alternative reading, the transporting of the goods would not be included, so overtime would be payable for those people involved in that part of the process, and it's only the packers that don't get the overtime payment. Does that make sense?
Yep. But
yeah?
Can it really be read as option 2 in grammatically? Can it actually be read like as you say in option 2?
Well, I think the intention of the legislature was for it to be read like that. Okay, because they wanted to cover every aspect of the chain of distribution. So right from the canning, freezing, storing, packing, and distribution. And in fact, they subsequently amended the legislation so it reflected option 2. But the way that it was grammatically read, so the literal interpretation of the clause is of the section, is the option 1. So because of the absence of an Oxford comma, packing for applied to shipment and packing for applied to distribution. Okay, because they didn't separate them out in the list. So the way that it would be grammatically read would be option 1, but the legislature intended option 2 and subsequently amended to reflect that. And of course, it was so risky that they decided to settle, and there was a $5 million settlement. So let me come back to you guys. So is that clear?
So to get my head around this, so basically what they were claiming was overtime for the distribution.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So the drivers of the trucks.
So if something like that goes into court, say they didn't settle, okay, then the court would look at the grammatical implication of that rather than the intent.
No, because it's this is America, so they take a slightly different approach towards the interpretation of statutes than Australia.
Yeah.
The common law approach in Australia. But if it were to go into Australian courts, then they always start off with the text, because you have to have a general understanding of what it means before you can then think about how the purpose affects that, right? So they will have a look at the text and the context, which includes looking at the grammatical arrangement. So they'd be leaning towards, at that point in time, option 1, because of the absence of the Oxford comma. But then thinking about the purpose, if it's trying to cover all aspects of the distribution process, then they may lean towards a different interpretation based on the purpose.
So that's America, or that's in Australia, they do the same thing?
No, so in Australia, they would look at the grammatical arrangement and the purpose. In the US, I believe that they still adopt a more literal approach to the interpretation of statutes.
Okay. Yeah.
Having said that, it depends on the jurisdiction, and it's certainly the case that it was risky enough for them to settle. Yeah.
Mm.
So, but that would have been completely resolved had they have put in that Oxford comma. So in this instance, sorry, I'll just reshare it again just so you can see the phrase. So in this instance, you would just put a comma here, and then it makes it quite clear that packing for shipment is one phrase and then distribution is separate. You see? Now in the New York Times article, it talks about how they amended the legislation and they put in semicolons all the way throughout this to make it super clear. And they put distributing here as well. So they went overboard, they went overkill on trying to make it clearer. And part of the reason for that is because their legislative drafting practice suggests that they shouldn't use Oxford commas. And that's something that we need to talk very briefly about. And that is that there is a body of writers who think that Oxford commas aren't appropriate and shouldn't be used. There's a group of people who think that they should be used whenever it's absolutely necessary to provide clarity that it is a list and that there are two separate items at the end. And then there is that there are a group of people who say use it all the time to avoid any doubt. Where you fall within that spectrum, I guess, is a matter for you in terms of drafting technique, but I would always err on the side of providing clarity rather than risk. That's your job as a lawyer, is to reduce the risk of misinterpretation. But yeah, the approach in schools differs from one state to the other, and some legislative drafting materials, so legislative drafting guides, say only use an Oxford comma if absolutely necessary. So you'll find that there's a variety of approaches to this. Okay, any questions?
Nicola?
Yeah.
Is in that case, like, is that where semicolons come in to be able to list items?
Well, I mean, if you can avoid a list in a sentence in the way that they did that in the header, and you can create a list of 1, 2, 3 in a vertical order, that's obviously to be preferred, because then you make it very clear what the last item on the list is. Because obviously in that case you would have packing for shipment, semicolon, and then distribution as the last item. But sometimes it's unavoidable in terms of putting it into a sentence. So if that's the case, you need to think about whether or not someone's going to misinterpret the list and add the two together. So the two words that are outside of the and, so either side of the and, whether they're going to put them together and make them a phrase. If that's the case, it's probably better to have an Oxford comma. And it can also happen with or, as we just saw in the legislation as well. Okay, so again, the two words either side of the or, are they going to be put together as one phrase when you intend them to be two separate things? If so, probably better to just use an Oxford comma.
Yep.
Okay. Good. All right, well, let's move on. So hang on, just give me a second. I think we shall now move on to, I'll just put actually an article in the chat in the conversation, which actually talks about those legislative drafting practices and the use of Oxford commas and how they're taught in schools, if you're interested in looking at that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Canadian comma case. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so Canadian comma case. So again, this is all focused on the use or inappropriate use of commas. So let's just have a look at the clause, which is on the screen there. Can anyone explain what the problem is with this particular clause?
Again, too many conditions on one sentence.
Yeah, I mean, you could break that up, as we've seen or talked about last week, you can break that up with a series of subclauses. You don't need to express it in one massive long sentence. Absolutely. But what's the specific problem with the way that they have created
Whether
this?
the termination applies to the first section of the clause or the second section,
Yes.
or does it apply to the whole thing?
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether you can have something that's absolutely correct when I think about it, because it's either, if it's correct, then there's no absolute. See, I'm using superfluous words now as well. Okay. So the commas create three clauses. Okay, so you can see I've got there are two commas that appear in that passage. I've entered them in here so you can see. So the first clause starts with shall be effective from the date it is made and shall continue in force for a period of 5 years from the date it is made, comma. Okay, at which point a new clause appears, and thereafter for successive 5-year terms, comma. So again, creates a third clause, unless and until terminated by 1 year prior notice in writing by either party. So what we've got here is this one is really the initial term. It tells us that the contract will run for a minimum of 5 years. Then we've got the renewal term. Okay, so it can be renewed for successive 5-year terms. And then we've got the termination part of the term. Okay, so unless and until terminated, it requires 1 year and it has to be noticed in writing. Now, the problem is, so we've got clause 1 is initial, clause 2 is renewal, clause 3 is termination. The problem is by creating 3 clauses like that, the question is whether or not this notice clause can apply to both to clause 1 and can also apply to clause 2. Okay, now it was argued that it can apply to both clauses because that then gives them the option of basically terminating after a year. Okay, so you can have the contract starts on day 1, you can give notice, it has to be a year's notice, and then the contract is terminated. The alternative argument is that the contract has to run for 5 years and only then can you give your notice. Okay, so that was the debate between, or that was the issue between the parties. Now the problem is with these 2 commas here is that with the 3 clauses, you can basically apply the notice to clause 1 and to clause 2. So if we pretend, let's pretend that this one doesn't exist. So clause 2 doesn't exist. Does clause 1 and clause 3 make sense when you read them? So shall be effective from the date it is made and shall continue in force for a period of 5 years from the date it is made unless and until terminated by 1 year prior notice in writing by either party. The answer is yes, it can. Okay, basically what we've done is we've bracketed this. So we can read 1 and 3 together without 2 at all. Okay, and of course we can also apply clause 3 to clause 2 as well. So, and thereafter for successive 5-year terms unless and until terminated by 1 year prior notice in writing by either party. So it's unfortunately that means that the notice clause applies to both the first clause and the second. Grammatically it can flow, and therefore they've created this problem that they intended to have a 5-year run before notice could occur, but actually you can give notice in the initial time frame. So that's the problem. The French version, however, which was subsequently found, didn't have 2 commas, it only had 1. So just take a moment to read the French version at the top there and note where the comma is. So you can see in this instance that it only creates 2 clauses. So the comma features here after the word made. So we now have shall be effective from the date it is made and shall continue in force for a period of 5 years from the date it is made. And then a new clause begins with and thereafter for successive 5-year terms unless and until terminated by 1 year prior notice in writing by either party. How is that different then?
They can only terminate.
So they can only
Yeah.
terminate when?
After the successive, so they've got to fulfill the first part.
Yeah, absolutely. So clause 1 stands alone and is not affected by notice. And it's clear that the notice is incorporated only into one clause, which is the second aspect of the sentence. Okay, so you can see there that that makes a substantial difference just by removing or including that comma. So the original provision has the comma here after made and then after terms, but if we delete that, if we delete this one here, it completely changes the notice provision within the contract.
That's
Okay.
how I rewrote it in that French version. I rewrote it that way.
Yeah. So, I mean, without obviously you could go into subclauses and, do a 3.1, 3.2 and make it much clearer than that. But even if you weren't doing that, then you can clearly see that the presence of the comma makes a huge difference to how we read the notice. And so subsequently they actually, because it's a Canadian case, it was written in both languages, and they could use that other document to identify that there was a drafting error. It was a mistake shared by the parties, and therefore that meant that it could be interpreted in accordance with the French version.
It's funny because I actually read that as only 2 clauses originally, but the second clause was from unless. So that, for me, had the first part, which was the 5 years from the date it was made and thereafter in successive 5 years terms. And then after that part, I then had unless and until terminated as the second clause. So the way I read it was that regardless whether or not you separated it into 3 clauses or 2, it still had the same effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except I don't think I understand what you're trying to do. I think I understand what you're trying to do, but I don't think that is the effect that you are looking for. So let me just show you. So if we remove that comma there and we put it here, okay, so we're all following with what I'm doing here.
That was how I originally read it, though, not how I altered it.
Not
That's
how you...
No. That's how I originally read it, that
Yeah.
the unless and until terminated was a standalone clause, and that the other part was all one clause. So that's how I originally interpreted it myself.
Yeah. But that's what happens when you do that. So look, I've moved it around to reflect where the comma arrives, and then you get all of the initial and renewal in one clause, and then you get the termination in a separate clause, which means that applies to the whole of that. So it would apply to both the initial and the renewal,
that's how I read it originally.
Yeah. So it's that version is the same as having the 2 commas, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So it's only the French version that works. Okay, good.
If you go back to the Canadian version,
you mean the original?
The original one? One that you put up with the 3 clauses broken down.
Yeah.
What is wrong with phrasing it in that way to imply that it actually refers to both? Can that be read as it implies for the termination implies for both 1 and 2?
But that's not how they wanted it, though, was it?
Yeah, it doesn't reflect the intentions of the intention of the parties. So this is an example of where the parties have negotiated a particular aspect of a contract, which is that the initial term runs for 5 years, and then either party can give notice during the renewal period. That was their negotiation, but that didn't transfer into the draft. So because the lawyers got comma happy and included an additional comma, they actually created a situation where the draft didn't reflect what they intended, and we ended up with the ability to give notice at any point. Now, although that wasn't what the parties originally intended, subsequently it suited one of the parties to argue that. So they went against their original intention for obviously an advantage in terms of the notice period. But the court was able to reflect on the French version and identify that this was a drafting error and that it aligned with and align it with the party's original intentions.
So
But, you know,
if you were to draft it in the way that it's drafted now, this means that the termination clause applies to both 1 and 2.
Yes, yes. If you've got a comma here and a comma here, then that's what you create, because you can read 1 and 3 together on their own, and you can read 2 and 3 together on their own. So the notice clause applies to both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether you put them in one sentence or you break them up, it won't make any difference.
Yeah.
So long as the commas are in that place.
Yeah, because it's because of this comma here in the original sentence, look, and this one here. Yeah. Okay, so that's a lesson in not being too happy with your commas. So in one sense, I'm saying Oxford commas, add commas, and then in the next sentence, I'm saying don't add a comma here because it creates another clause. Okay, so what are we doing now? Let's have a look. Yes, okay, so the next one is I'm going to launch a poll, but first I'm going to show you a sentence, and I want to know how many errors you spot in that. So when I launch the poll in a minute, the options are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 errors. Okay, so count the errors as you read it. I'll just give you a minute to do that. Okay, so everybody happy for me to stop that and launch the poll now? I can't do both at the same time. Yeah? Okay, so I'll just launch the poll. Okay, so how many errors did you think were in that sentence? Okay, all done. So 50-50. Okay, so two out of 4 of you thought there were 3, and 2 out of 4 of you thought there were 4. So 50% thought there were 3 errors, 50% thought there were 4 errors. Let's go back and have a look now. Okay, so what's the first error? So taking it line by line, what's the first error?
It is.
Yeah, so here we've got its, which is possessive because it hasn't got the apostrophe. So it refers to a particular thing, like a company, blah, 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 its incorporated premises are, and the its refers back to the company. So here, that's possessive. It should actually be a contraction of it is. So it should look like that. Or better still, what should we write in legal drafting?
It is.
Yeah, so it's preferable to avoid contractions wherever possible. It's not so bad if you're engaging in email communication with, a colleague, in inter-office communication, but when you're dealing with clients or you're dealing with your opponent, it's better to avoid them if possible. Okay.
I actually make sure I do it all the time, and then I can't lapse back.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's a good idea as well, is because then you never get the wrong version. Okay, so what else is wrong with that sentence?
The comma after the word work, is that necessary?
No, that's fine. It creates a new clause, but it's referring back to the grammatical errors. Okay, so that's okay. That's not the problem.
Should there be an apostrophe after students?
Yeah, absolutely. So because it's not saying in a student's work, then I think it's plural here. Okay, so what we're talking about is the work of the student, but instead of saying the work of students, but instead of saying the work of students, we say students' work, which means we have to show possession, which, because it's plural, is just via an apostrophe. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you'd got a student here, we'd have to change that to that. because it's singular and you have to have an apostrophe and then an S. Okay, so possession is necessary there because we're talking about the work of someone else, the work belonging to the student. Okay, so those are 2 errors. What else is problematic?
There
Yeah, okay, what's wrong with it?
should be they are.
Yeah, so they are sometimes difficult to spot. Instead, they'd used their, THERE, which is talking about place. So where are my car keys? They're over there. Yeah, or you can use there as there is, there are several problems, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's the 3rd one. Where's the 4th? For those of you who thought there were 4, where's the 4th?
We are.
Yeah, okay.
I've actually, there's 4 now. I chose 3 before. That was I was one of the students. But yeah, I just spotted the additional error. So
oh,
yeah,
well,
so
you didn't need to confess, but
well,
yes.
yeah, that was me. So we should be we are.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
says were. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So it should be either we're. So the apostrophe represents the fact that you've taken the A out of we are. Okay, or preferably, as we've just discussed, as we are reading, and then you avoid the contraction issue. Okay, so there were 4 errors in that one. Okay, just a bit of fun to get your brain thinking, but I bet you all did the same thing, which is that you had to read it more than once to identify the problems because our brain superimposes the correct version. And that's the issue with proofreading. When you're really close to the draft, if you've just finished a draft, you read it as you want it to say rather than what it actually says. So it's always good to take a break from your work and then go back. You're more likely to spot those errors. And word spell check is not infallible. Like in those situations, because they're all spelt correctly, you know, there and were and all of those kind of things, it won't always pick up on them. Generally, it picks up on grammar issues and highlights them underneath, but it's not a perfect system. So there's no substitute for proofreading, unfortunately. Okay.
I do use Grammarly though.
Yeah, Grammarly is pretty good. Again, it's not 100%.
It's not foolproof. No.
Okay, no. And that can be sometimes when the AI doesn't understand what you're trying to convey, especially if you're using technical terms and things like that, it confuses it.
Or statute.
Yeah, but it's also quite good, you know, just to do a trial of that, just so that it makes you realize quite a lot as you got how you make those errors when you're drafting. You know, I think I'm pretty good at typing, but because I type really quickly, I do make the odd error like that, and it helps me be more alert to my drafting. But yes, there's no substitute for proofreading, unfortunately. Okay, so what I would like to do now, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I was going to do an activity and send you off into breakout groups, but we're not going to have time to do that. So I will just share with you the 2 things that I wanted you to have a look at very briefly. So the unseen activity is to try and redraft the following 2 file notes. Okay, so that means that you need to identify the problem and then try and redraft it so that you avoid the problem. Okay, and there might be more than one problem in each of them. So how about I just give you, you can just work on that at home right now on your own. How about I give you 2 minutes, it shouldn't take you that long, 2 minutes to redraft that to portray grammatically correct information. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask while you're doing that. I should have some like elevator music or something now, shouldn't I? Okay, so how are we all going?
Good.
Have you got a rough draft?
The first one is a bit tricky, but I could give the second one a go if.
Yep, sure.
That's
all right.
You want.
Yeah,
okay,
go,
I'll start.
Go for it.
Well, the second one, it'd be an administrative error has been made by the Department of Planning, and I would replace the comma with the word and. it will be rectified within the next 24 hours.
Okay, great. So you have identified that that is a comma splice, which is correct. Okay, so we've got two independent, they're related, but they're independent sentences. And so it needs either punctuation, it needs punctuation like a full stop, okay, to split it, or it needs a conjunction to join these two related sentences together. Okay, that's a comma splice, so that's absolutely right. There's something else wrong with that particular sentence as well. Did anyone else spot anything else wrong with that?
Is this an example of a passive voice?
Absolutely.
Well?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in this instance, it again reverses what would be the traditional subject verb object order. So who has made the or what has made the administrative error? It's the department. So that should come first. So the sentence should be rewritten to say the Department of Planning has made an administrative error and it will be rectified within the next 24 hours. Or you could put a full stop there and start a new sentence. It will be rectified within the next 24 hours. Okay, so passive and comma splice in number 2. What about number 1? What are the issues with number 1?
The second part, the setting out of how the expert's report refers to the letter of advice.
Yes.
So it should be rewritten, reflect that.
Yeah, so the problem is that, you know, like the Canadian comma case, that refers back to the previous part, but in the previous part there's pleadings and letter of advice. So which one does that second part of the sentence refer to? Now, because we know the difference between pleadings and a letter of advice, and because it mentions the word advice, then we can assume that the expert report has affected the advice and therefore the letter of advice. Does that make sense? But you have to kind of work through that process to work out to which part of the sentence it's referring. So there's a problem with that. But also there's a problem with the first part of the sentence as well. Can anyone identify what's wrong with that? Okay, well that is also expressed in the passive voice. So they've been drafted so that we have no idea who has amended the pleadings or who has settled the letter of advice. Now, you know, you can say, well, it's implied that the person writing the file note has done that, but clarity requires that the subject is identified and that you have subject, verb, object. So in this instance, you could rewrite it to say, I have amended the pleadings, or Sarah or Bob has amended the pleadings, and I have settled a letter of advice, or Bob or whoever has settled a letter of advice. So you can see there that the passive voices in this instance disguises the subject altogether, whereas in the second illustration, we know who the subject is. It's the Department of Planning, but the order of the sentence is just switched around. Okay. Any questions about that? No? Okay.
No.
So that brings me to the end of the workshop, right on cue. So unless you have any further questions, I will see you next week. Any questions?
None for me.
No? Oh, good. Okay. So this week there's no drafting to really share, but please have a look at last week's task, especially now we've covered a bit more grammar. You can go back to your original draft for that contract and you might be able to do a bit more tweaking to make it even better. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week. See ya.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.
Bye.